South Asia Part 2. We just got done talking about the physical geography, climate, landforms, and historical findings that lead us to what became the Indian subcontinent and that of South Asia in terms of its geological and geographic past. Now we talk about the human properties that lead us into South Asia Part 2, and that would be colonization, because like I said before, colonization is one of the other ways that this region becomes a region, because it's interconnected in its aspect of being colonized by the British. So in the 1830s, the British come to this region as they're expanding their British Empire around the world. If you recall, the sun never set on the British Empire. They had a wide swath of territory around the world. So we have British India, and it becomes India in 1947 when India gains its independence. We had the country of Pakistan, which was Muslim-dominated regions, and that was separated by India. We actually had West Pakistan and East Pakistan, which was Pakistan. East Pakistan becomes Bangladesh, and West Pakistan, as we know it now, becomes Pakistan. The partition of India was rejected by many, as that was detrimental for the people in the region and a negative impact of British colonization in the area. But however, it was something that took place when the region largely got its independence. In 1971, this Pakistani division takes place. In 1947, India gains its independence, but the partition of India and this entire region is kind of important in the sense that it leads us in the idea of civil disobedience. So we have Mohandas Gandhi, who is known as Great Soul, Mahatma, and he uses civil disobedience, which most notably was the Salt March, and in 1930, so this is about 100 years after the British are in the area, and he's gathering followers, and they're making salt as they move, which was illegal in the British colony in the area, as civil disobedience to reject the British Empire and to cast them out of the region. It's successful, and actually civil disobedience in this way was inspired civil disobedience in the United States in the civil rights movements in the 1950s and 60s. Kind of interesting. Leads us to globalization and development. And we'll be talking about these historical happenings as they infuse themselves into the rest of the section. Globalization and economic reforms. India is home to the third largest economy behind the United States and China, and this is in terms of purchasing power parity. However, immense disparities still exist throughout the country, of course, and that could be said of many countries. After a financial crisis in the 1980s, however, the government of India initiates economic reforms which proved to be successful. If you remember, when we usually hear economic reforms in the 1980s in other regions, especially regions that are considered to be the global south or developing regions, we usually associate those with structural adjustment programs or belt measuring, or belt tightening rather, by belt tightening measures, SAPs. And if you remember, those were quite bad. They actually rarely ever worked out. Maybe they actually never worked out, I'm not quite sure. But they're negative. They were initiated and mandated by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. And in this case, India takes the initiative on itself, creating its own reforms, because if you know, those belt tightening measures usually come at the harm of the people through some of their reform practices, because the money has to be cut from somewhere, so it's usually social safety nets in other places. India does this themselves, and it's quite successful in the sense that it doesn't cause a major problem like it did in other parts of the world. So this is good. This is good news for them. And it's why India has risen to be a member of the BRICS. If you remember, the BRICS countries are this force of countries that is reckoning with the United States and Western Europe as we knew it as leaders of the world. The BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Yes, the BRICS. I thought I missed a letter. India is one of them, and a quick rise to fame, and it looks like it's going to stay in terms of its economic trajectory and certainly its population growth, which we'll get into a second. But manufacturing is fueling much of this economic growth. And in 2015, per capita GDP in India was 20 times higher than what it was in 1992. So things are going well for a good percentage of the people of India as well, not just the elites, which is quite important if you want your entire country to rise to be in the forefront of global leadership. Whoa, too fast. Where are we? Okay. Oh boy, we are jumping around. Offshore outsourcing. This is a vocabulary term from the book, that's why it's bold. It's quite easy, especially now with the movie under our view. But the contracting of certain business practices and functions or production functions to providers where labor and other costs are lower. So we outsource things. This has been taking place in the United States for decades. It's highlighted in the movie Outsourced from 2006. Hopefully an enjoyable film, or at least enjoyable enough. We see a man is sent to India to train his replacement in a telecommunication center, and he teaches them how to take his own job, actually. You'll know then later on that their facility in India is even shipped to somewhere where there's even cheaper labor as this continues. This happens with factories, this happens with telecommunications, and all the like. It's the continual move for where labor and production is at its lowest point, so more money can be made. Dalal Street is Mumbai's Wall Street. Mumbai, a large financial center of India. It's their Wall Street, and it's a rise of it shows a rise of the Indian middle class, which again, very important. Many people from India that have left the country, that have gone on to jobs in Europe and the United States, good paying jobs, whether they be doctors, lawyers, those involved in technology, specifically referenced in the book was technology, but that brain drain that we talk about are actually returning home for less salary, but still equal standard of living to that in the United States, because the money goes a lot further there. So this return back is creating an Indian middle class coupled with manufacturing and IT and other things that are taking place in India, and is actually raising some middle level of the country in terms of its people. Food production and the Green Revolution. You remember the Green Revolution a time back, actually in our introductory chapter, chapter 1, geographic exploration or whatever it was called. But we have here an increase in inequality. Wealthy farmers have become richer, while poor farmers are driven out of work through automation and needing special seeds and certain chemicals to take place. They buy up parts of the land. So small farmers are driven to be poor. They usually seek work in cities, and farming is transformed as they knew it, which takes place again in many parts of the world in this same way. But the Green Revolution in India began in the 1960s. It produced a lot of yield, but it did lead to uneven development. But these farming mechanisms, however, have had negative environmental impacts, which does cue our other vocabulary term at this moment is agroecology, in the sense of small farmers. And this agroecology may be a remedy to the Green Revolution, where farmers are able to go back to a small scale by incorporating their knowledge for the local land and farming in a more environmentally friendly and ecologically friendly way. And this is important, balancing agroecology with the Green Revolution, because the Green Revolution, while had certain negative impacts, did allow India to become an exporter in certain foods, as we know, rice and among others, and did allow the country to begin to feed itself better with its large population. Remember, we're talking over 1 billion with a B, people in India, one to soon be the largest country in terms of people in the entire world. At this point, still half of the malnourished children of the world coming from India, largely because of that large population, but still a lot of people. So there's still a lot of food to have to go around. It's not getting to everywhere that it needs to get to. Microcredit, we talk about this when we talk about poverty. I apologize if I cut you off there. But microcredit, another vocabulary term, a program based on peer support that makes very small loans, again, usually less than 100 American dollars, available to very low income entrepreneurs. So these are small loans. The Grameen Bank was established and founded in this case by an economist from Bangladesh, Muhammad Yunus, in 1976. So we're talking 40 plus years ago already. Yunus would eventually go on with the Grameen Bank to win a Nobel Peace Prize for this endeavor in 2006, decades later. But these small loans go a long way. 90% are women borrowers, and the success rate of paying back these loans are 98%. So it's successful in that way. However, the studies have found that it might not always be the most effective way of driving people, of removing people from poverty. It might improve them, improve their situations, but it might not adequately move people out of poverty. But largely successful in a lot of cases. It's just not necessarily. We need to provide you with all the information. Let's put it that way. I mean, we can say all the successes about it in the sense like the book cites. It's provided $25 billion to 100 million people in over 40 countries, the Grameen Bank, and systems like it. And it has provided the support needed for mainly women to be able to supply a craft or a trade that's been able to lift themselves out of poverty. It's been shown that that is not quite enough, that it needs to be also paired with other improvements in social safety nets and other improvements to the system like savings accounts, insurance programs, and other things. Because again, these people are quite vulnerable with a small loan. They may be doing well, but they may be just an accident or something, an emergency away from going and falling back into poverty. So again, things to keep in mind, but very successful, largely speaking, when we paint a broad brush. That brings us to power and politics, and we talk about the Hindu-Muslim relationship that was discussed at just a moment, and I'll talk about it more because I don't think I was specific enough for our purposes. Independence leaders such as Gandhi and Nehru united the religions being Hindu and Muslim, to force a British exit, the OG Brexit, if you will. They leave in 1947, we know, in India, and since the religious differences occasionally cause conflict in certain parts based on the caste system, diet, and history. So we'll talk about the caste system on the next slide. Diet, because Hindus, that may be like, for instance, vegetarian or something that go against the diet of the Muslim people, and history because of colonial role, and also the history because of colonial role in the sense that, like here, India and Pakistan were created as secular states. Remember, they're not theocratic in the sense that their government is run through a religion. They're secular, like the United States. Yet India has the second largest Muslim population in the world. But again, however, so let's break this down for ourselves. India is associated with Hinduism, a religion, and India is regarded as a Hindu state, a Hindu country. Because it is so large, however, it still has the second most amount of Muslims in the entire world, second only behind that of Indonesia. Bet you thought it was in the Middle East or somewhere like that, but actually it is in Indonesia, but more on that later when we talk about Southeast Asia. So while it's a Hindu state, second most amount of Muslim people, because again, we're dealing with over 1 billion people. But Pakistan, which was once West and East, Bangladesh and Pakistan, are Muslim states. They associate most with Islam. And so during this time, during the partition of India and back during that British exit, you had people that in fear of persecution and animosity and religious nationalism, where Muslims living in northern India and parts of India left for Pakistan and Bangladesh, and then you had people in Bangladesh and Pakistan that were Hindu flee to India. So you had these large movements of people in clashes that were often dangerous and even lethal, moving back and forth to get themselves into a country that most associated itself with the religion in fear of persecution or fear. in general. So religious nationalism still exists and continues to perpetuate struggles in South Asia, but again, not necessarily what it used to be back in quite a long time ago, already half a century. So caste and politics, and we should have known what the caste system is, but it's a complex ancient Hindu system for dividing society into hereditary, hierarchical classes. And so there are a variety of those, but again, hereditary, that you're born into this caste system, and there isn't that level of social mobility that you see in the United States, where pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you can become from poor to rich. That doesn't take place to a large extent here. But on a local level, political parties develop a vote-getting strategy around the caste system, so that's its current influence in politics today. But the caste system is more on a sociocultural level as well. It's how people even continue to function and live within society more generally, and how they associate. Now Gandhi, back in the day, launched an organized effort to get past discrimination in the caste system, especially the Dalits or the untouchables among the lowest of the class, the caste system. And continuing forward, policies established by British India have been expanded, now that it's India, to reserve 49.5% of government jobs for the people of the lower three castes in that caste system. Those lower three make up 64% of the population, so not quite an even trade. Now we talk about conflicts, and there's a lot of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This one not mentioned in the book because it's a problem in the now. But conflict in Kashmir. So we're going to be talking about northern India, the region of India on the Pakistani border. And there's been long fights between this area. In fact, it's kind of like at a standstill, like we talked about some of those areas battling with Russia, like Abkhazia, where they're just in this limbo in terms of their current conflict. However, we have a conflict here with India and Pakistan fighting over this area, and then actually an area that the people in this area of Kashmir support independence from the two of them, however not obviously going to work its way onto a ballot. And so there's a conflict in Kashmir that has led to clashes throughout time. We're dealing with countries that have nuclear arsenals on the border, also area. So this gets complicated. This area is near China, which could escalate a larger conflict in the region. So these conflicts continue to perpetuate themselves, but have been a long-standing conflict for decades. War and Reconstruction in Afghanistan. We talked about Afghanistan before. We talked about the Soviets, the Afghanis back in the day. We talked about their move toward westernization. But however, there was a time of destabilization. The Soviets go in because this is nearby. They're the USSR at the time, because they controlled a lot of those Central Asian states. They go in, they take on the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen, because of, again, remember, proxy war for the Cold War that's taking place. So the Mujahideen are backed by Pakistan, backed by the United States, and they're battling the Soviets in Afghanistan from 79 to 89. They are defeated. Over 10,000 Soviets killed in this case. The book largely covers War and Reconstruction in Afghanistan because it continues forward by talking about then the United States getting involved just about a decade later, because it discusses the Taliban. Now the Taliban, there's a radical movement within the Mujahideen. So the Mujahideen we were supporting, we were part of, we armed them, we funded them, and at a point a group of a very radical conservative group breaks out wanting Sharia law and things like that, and they break out and form the Taliban and control much of the country. And there's association obviously with Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and the United States gets involved, and they go in the early 2000s, and they have their way in Afghanistan for quite some time until Osama bin Laden is eventually killed, and then they largely leave Afghanistan. Now we're going to come back to one more point about Afghanistan and the Soviets and the Mujahideen in just a few more slides at the end, but that's enough for now. Sri Lanka's civil war, not going to talk a lot about this, but largely this is something that's more situated with Buddhists versus, again, this is like they have over 2/3 of the population Buddhists here in Sri Lanka. Remember, Sri Lanka kind of looks like a teardrop. Remember also 1972, it makes a change from Ceylon to Sri Lanka, but 18% about are a minority called the Tamil people, Tamil, Tamil. They form a group called the Tamil Tigers, and they for quite a long period of time they launched kidnappings and terrorist attacks to fight the majority there. That goes on for quite some time through a civil war in Sri Lanka that sets the economy back. It's largely wrapped up now. Nepal's rebels, this comes out of a Maoist movement. Remember Mao Zedong? You should remember from another class, perhaps. We did not talk about Mao Zedong yet, so don't fret yet. We'll get into that soon. But what happens there is a movement in Nepal that comes from influence through the north, through Chinese leader Mao Zedong and these Maoist people that launch movements, rebels throughout Nepal. And really, for our purposes, the book touches on it, but it's not really a fundamental factor of this chapter. The Rohingya, so what happens there, this is something that's increasingly become more and more of an issue. It's not the first time this has happened, but in 2017, in the fall, after this book, of course, has been out, it's in the news, maybe you've heard of it, but the Rohingya are a Muslim minority in Myanmar, formerly Burma, in Southeast Asia, a region that we'll get to in just a bit, are being persecuted, and so they are therefore fleeing and becoming refugees into neighboring Bangladesh. And so what we're seeing there is a large movement, thousands and thousands and thousands of people running, moving, fleeing as Muslim minorities in Myanmar, Burma, to join Bangladesh. And we know Bangladesh is a Muslim majority country because that's the way it was founded when it was East Pakistan decades ago. So understand these regional conflicts and obviously the book a little bit in more detail, but understand them when we talk about specific groups and how they interact with each other in terms of how countries interact with each other, especially in neighboring ways. And we're going to revisit Rohingya in more detail. Some of these issues we can talk about more. They're like, wow, Guy, why didn't you talk about those a little bit more? We're just giving them a sentence or two. And this is a class, I'm supposed to learn something more than just some quick words. But again, these things have largely settled themselves. They're more historical, and I'd like to keep the focus on some things that are a bit more influential and things that are a bit more contemporary. So we're going to revisit Rohingya when we talk about Myanmar, because that's actually where it's happening, and they're fleeing to this area. But we'll be talking more about this in a bit. But again, that's why I do what I do. Urbanization. So only 33% of South Asia live in urban areas, but world's top 20 metro areas, 5 of them in this region of South Asia. Mumbai. So the book in its subsection of urbanization actually gives an entire subsection to Mumbai itself, known as South Asia's wealthiest and most culturally influential city. 1/3 of all taxes in India and 40% of all trade in India come from Mumbai. It's home to Bollywood, which is Hindi cinema. It's like our Hollywood movie industry, Bollywood, and a rapidly growing middle class for the Indian people. And so we know that Bangalore is India's Silicon Valley. However, Mumbai is a close second. 22 million people in Mumbai. It's a lot of people. It's not the largest, though, in the area. So, but it's the most influential in terms of culturally and financially speaking. And we'll talk about Dharavi, which is a slum, 1 million people in less than 1 square mile. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about specifically that region of India. Urban risks to women and children. Children are all too often working rather than attending school, which we know can certainly be a problem for their future. Employment for children includes factories, which we know are quite dangerous, street vending, again, not for children, and sex work, certainly inexcusable and not for children. But they're forced into this kind of work oftentimes. So are women. Women are also forced into sex work in brothels and otherwise. I recommend for all of you out there that want more and more and more knowledge and resources, Behind the Beautiful Forevers, Life, Death, and Hope in a Mumbai Undercity. It's by Catherine Bu. I have read it myself. It is, well, it's a good book, but it does tell the story of life for those that are living in an urban slum in Mumbai. It's quite informative, but obviously not necessarily a feel-good story. But I really recommend it. Check it out. Let me know if you check it out. That'd be cool. But again, there's something worth checking out for more information on the life of these folks that do have to live in these types of conditions. South Asia has 10 million children between the ages of 5 and 14 years old that are working and not in school. And one last thing about this, obviously they're forced into this kind of work, more so for women, not for children, involving sex work. They talk about the geography of sex work and how the mobile phone, the cell phone, has actually changed that. And they're no longer necessarily confined to that space, confined to that brothel, and how the cell phone has actually allowed women to have a little bit more control and autonomy on the work that they do and their clients and where it's taking place. So it's kind of interesting, I think worth mentioning. Population and gender. South Asia is the most populous region in the world. It overtook East Asia in 2008. East Asia coming up next, going to be dominated largely probably by China, maybe Japan a bit. But South Asia, most populous region in the world, coming from 2008. It's also the smallest geographically. Therefore, if it's the largest population, smallest geographically, it has to be the most densely populated. Only Afghanistan and Pakistan have fertility rates above 2.4 children per woman in the region. Therefore, population, in terms of those fertility rates, they are slowing down. However, there's just still so many people that's why we see huge population increases. Afghanistan and Pakistan, total, they have fertility rates that are over 2.4 in the region, the only two. Population is most dense near coasts and other waterways, and we'll be discussing that. But again, near the coast in some of these cities like Kolkata and Mumbai and Dhaka, if you will, because it's near it's part of that delta, just off of the delta, that Ganges Brahmaputra delta. But again, it kind of makes sense. This is something that's a long-lasting idea that humans settle near water for transportation, trade, and general livability. So that's nothing new here. It actually is quite intuitive. However, this is something to keep track of because a lot of people usually get all shook up when I try to give them these statistics, and they inevitably don't do well on the exam. By 2030, China will be shrinking by 20 million people per decade, and India will be growing by 100 million people per decade. One more time. China's population will be declining by 20 million people per decade, per 10 years, while India's population will be increasing by 100 million people in a 10-year span. And there's going to be a variety of factors that there's some gender imbalance, there's some policy changes, there's population increases in terms of birth rates that will be altered. Oh, there's going to be a lot of factors that go into why these changes are taking place. But it is certain that India will replace China in the coming years as the world's most populated country. And already the third largest economy in the world, it will soon be the largest country in terms of population, and with that, perhaps economic increases as well. May you be the mother to 100 sons. I'm getting a little crafty with my titles here. That is a toast at a wedding that a woman gets when she's getting married. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But the rights of women fare best in central and southern India, in the South Asian region as a whole. So in South Asia, women in India, specifically central and southern India, not just India in general, but southern and central India, the rights of women are best. Let's talk about, and Kerala is there. Kerala is an area of India where the government has focused and promoted women. They have focused on women's education and other factors to lift women. Coincidentally, this happens to be India's most Christian region. In terms of number of Christians, this region has the largest Christian population of India, but it's a region in southern India where the government has focused and promoted women, and it has seen quite success for women there, which goes and does fare why the rights of women fare best in central and southern India. Kerala is a great example through the force of the government. Now, gender imbalance and female infanticide. So because of this toast and this tradition that that male children will be better for families, largely comes under the idea because the same ideas that it'll provide the family tree to be expanding. They'll be able to provide more because they're stronger in the economy. They're stronger in terms of creating and leading a family because of the sort of the patriarchy, if you will. And so they're to be known to be what a family would want to have. So this toast sort of goes and focuses on this point here in gender imbalance. Why I say this is because between 30 and 70 million there is a gender imbalance of 30 to 70 million people in India found from their census as a result of female infanticide and gender imbalance. So there are people that are seeking out technology to try to find out if it's a boy or a girl, to try to abort a girl. That practice is now illegal. Good. And however, nonetheless, female infanticide still occurs where they are neglecting or killing female babies in order to continue to try for males. This is a problem because at a point there's going to be too many males that are not able to find female partners, and that does perpetuate problems, as we saw with China's one-child policy, but more on that later. Women and the Taliban in Afghanistan, as we mentioned before, decades ago, before all of the trouble, if you will, that took place when Afghanistan was on a path towards westernization and progress, women were quite free. However, since the Taliban has taken over in Afghanistan, women are sheltered and they are not able to go to school, and they're not able to show themselves, live a proper, as we would perceive as a proper life in society. However, it's the norm there in large parts. But women are mistreated in Taliban Afghanistan. So the last, sociocultural issues. Now they're saying, when you raise a daughter, you are watering another man's plant. That one's a little bit more theoretical for me, but here we go. Let's jump in. Purdah, vocabulary term, the practice of concealing women from the eyes of non-family men, especially during their reproductive years. which led us to dowry, which is a sum of money paid to a bride's family, paid by the bride's family to the groom to essentially take their daughter away for marriage. So you have a daughter, which apparently you didn't want because in the first place, because we know what was happening there in large parts. Obviously, not in all cases, of course. But again, have a daughter. You pay a man, you pay the family of a groom to take her off your hands, if you will, to be married, and therefore that's a dowry. And this kind of took place because of Perdal. They were hiding the women in a lot of ways, if you will, to be paying this dowry. Now, a woman's power and mobility in this society increases when she becomes a mother-in-law. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. However, one other caveat is with more affluence and education, a dowry is actually increasing. So in the past, this was used to just be sort of a thing for the wealthy people. And sort of, interestingly enough, dowries are now sort of on the rise. So that actually wraps us up for the human sort of portion of things, part 2. So that wraps up actually South Asia part 2. And next will be our subregions, continuing in just when you click on the next one.